knowing that I can be flawed and vulnerable and honest with my people, and that they can do that for me because of compassion, and knowing that like our goal is to agitate this system. Our goal is to like do better, want more for ourselves, and not in that stereotypical like, you know, I gotta get more, the materialistic kind of thing, but more like wanting to be more whole, wanting to be more happy and more contented and more just like...
407 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and dedicated and long endured can live through such a struggle. We are met on a great battlefield of that war.
My name is Amanda Spitfire, and I am an eclectic narrative trauma therapist and anti-oppression organizer. So being a trauma counselor and being an anti-oppression organizer, for me, those two worlds are very connected. I can't really do one without the other. What that means is my analysis and understanding and like education on like anti-racism and feminism and anti-oppression organizing influences the way I do therapy, influences the way I do mental health work, influences the way I like exist in the world with people who are in crisis or surviving something or living with something or just like trying to be. And in that same way, whenever I'm doing organizing, when I'm out in different communities, my communities, when I'm doing harm reduction work, when I'm just hanging out, honestly, with some people, if I'm at an action, if I'm at a meeting, if I'm just like walking down the street with a friend, I always have that kind of trauma-informed mind of like the way that I try to respond to people is based on the knowledge that everyone is kind of surviving things, right? Whether you have any kind of specific traumatic like history, or if you are just surviving living under white supremacy, or surviving living under capitalism, or surviving living under rape culture, ableism, right? So the way that I interact with humans in general, people in general, has both of these frames. In specific, I work in two different places. I have a community practice where I work in Kensington doing predominantly dual diagnosis trauma counseling with survivors of drug addiction, poverty, sexual violence, domestic violence, police violence, things of this nature. And then I also have a private practice in Fairmount. I'm there one day a week. That's mostly to like allow me to do all the other things I do that I don't get paid for, the collectives I work with, the anti-oppression organizing I do. And that model, that kind of like being able to find the way to use the different systems that we are all kind of bound under to help me do what I want to do in the world has worked for me very well in the last few years. Meaning, I get paid pretty well at my private practice, but I only spend a very tiny amount of time there because I prioritize the anti-oppression work and the trauma work I do in other communities. But it allows me to do a lot of volunteer work. It allows me to run workshops. It allows me to do volunteer trauma counseling, crisis counseling, intervention work with people who can't afford to like have people like me come in and do that work for them. And it also allows me to prioritize community care, like my community, like the people. I surround myself with a lot of people that do very similar work that I do. And so community care and self-care is very important to me as a trauma counselor and as an anti-oppression organizer, because burnout is so prevalent in our communities because of how messed up and like disastrous these systems that we're stuck under are. So it's very important to me to, in all the different roles that I play in my life, have that mind frame, that like community mind frame of like, how do we take care of each other? Because self-care and community care are the same thing in some ways in my mind, and they are integral to survival. They are integral to like sustainability of our worlds, of our communities, of our gardens, of our families. I think that's about it. Also the collectives I work with the Sex Worker Outreach Project, which is an organization that works to fight have decriminalization of sex work and fight stigma and violence against sex workers, among other things. I work with Project Safe, which is a harm reduction organization that does work with street-based sex workers and drug users, predominantly in Kensington, but in other parts of Philadelphia. And then I work with the Up Against the Law Legal Collective, and we run Know Your Rights trainings and Stop Snitching on Yourself trainings all throughout Philadelphia for anybody who asks, but predominantly in communities of color and with activists who are constantly under the attack of like the police state. So we will go out to different places, and all of those things that we do are free. Like all those collectives, all the people, the members, the collective members, like my crew that I roll with on a pretty regular basis, all of that is free, because distribution of resources and access to things that people don't generally have access to is a very integral part of all of the work I do in my life. So my two biggest influences is a very hard question, and I'm not going to really answer it. I think for me, I am inspired by the people that I meet on the daily. I'm inspired by my coworkers. I'm inspired by the members of my collectives that like run themselves ragged to do like really important work in the world and to like make each other feel whole. So for me, it's really important for people to know that, you know, we have everyday idols, right? Like we have people in our families, in our communities, in our schools, around us, like the person you meet on the corner and have like the most like amazing, like connective, like inspiring conversation with, like that can be the person that you learn from, that can be the person that you like take inspiration and hope from. And that's kind of how I live my life, which is also a big part of the narrative piece of my therapy and the way that I live in the world, is that like stories are inspiring to me. Like listening to people's stories of like trauma, of resiliency, of strength, of like knowing that people are like going through it on a daily and still getting up every morning and like doing what they have to do to like feel healthier, to feel better, to like inspire the people they care about and like allow the people they care about to inspire and care about them. Those are my idols. Those are my people that are like my biggest influences, and I've had them gratefully and thankfully all throughout my life. I've been doing this kind of work, this collab between anti-oppression work and like a trauma-informed lens on the way I see the world for about 13, 14 years. And I've been very lucky to have lots of influences and idols along the way, like, you know, everyday heroes, for lack of a better word, since I started back when I was like 19 years old. So yeah, my biggest influences are everyday people who kind of like shine a little brighter and like work a little harder and like do that one extra step to like let you know like this is hard, but it's okay and we're gonna get through it together. The first thing I can remember doing that sort of probably is where I got started in this world is I was like 18 or 19. I'm originally from North Jersey. I went to school at Rutgers University, and there was a protest. There were two protests that happened over the course of my first year at Rutgers. One had to do with police brutality and shutting down Route 18 to protest the way that people of color were being treated in New Brunswick, and just like gentrification and slumlord issues that were going on in terms of like the differences between students at Rutgers and like people who were from New Brunswick. And then the second one was a Take Back the Night, which is a annual event that happens internationally to raise awareness on rape culture, on sexual and domestic violence. So I think that's probably where I got started with the more active outward stuff. And then did that all throughout my time at Rutgers, all throughout my time in New Brunswick. I was there for 7 or 8 years and got involved in anti-war organizing, got involved in other kinds of feminist and anti-racist work, was working with an ARA, an anti-racist action organization, and just started putting together the connections that like all of these different issues that people were struggling with came from these like oppressive systems that needed to be sort of like targeted, broke down, and then like changed or taken over. So that is sort of where my like holistic anti-oppression, anti-racist frame comes from, is that time doing work with the Community Empowerment Project, the Anti-Racist Action, Take Back the Night, these kinds of organizations in New Brunswick. I was also working as a counselor doing inpatient psych work with adolescents, which is a little bit different than what I do now, but my mental health career and like the knowing that I wanted to do that kind of helping mental health work started like when I was real young. I'm like the oldest of 3. My parents got divorced when I was 7. So like I've been taking care of like kids and like crew in my family since I was like 10. So that idea about like knowing that people needed to be able to get through their hurt and to like have venues that were safe for healing has kind of always been a part of my life since I was like real little. But when I moved to Philly in 2007, I started working at a methadone clinic and saw even more so the ways that which poverty, racism, police violence, a lack of access to resources, a lack of access to mental health and medication was really like keeping people suffering. And so I got into a bunch of different organizations in Philly. I started working with different groups that were focusing on increasing access to mental health. And then I also started getting involved with organizations that were fighting capitalism and racism, which led me to be somewhat involved in the Occupy movement and then the Black Lives Matter movement in the last 5 years, from 2011. So I got into this again just by way of like people, like seeing people, knowing people, getting feedback from people about the way in which like I as a person with like class and able-bodiedness and like race privilege could use my power and my privilege to support communities, and then also learning that there were a lot of things that I needed to unpack and heal from in terms of being a femme presenting person, in terms of being somebody who like had to leave home for various reasons, in terms of being a person in recovery, which I am. So there's a lot of different ways that I have certain kinds of minority statuses, but a lot of different ways that I have lots of power and privilege. And being able to see that all in this like spectrum through all these different humans and all these different conversations, reflecting that back to me, is how I got into this. And is why I'm gonna do it till I die. So this isn't necessarily my favorite movie, but Let It Burn, which is a semi-recent, I think it came out about 3 or 4 years ago, maybe a little less than that, documentary on the story of the fire department and police facilitated bombing of the Move family. It's a very powerful movie. It's incredibly important for like every human to see, especially if you're from Philadelphia, especially if you're a white person from Philadelphia or just have come here recently. The Move bombing in 1985, May 13th, 1985, is a integral, like intense, important piece of Philadelphia's history, but also the history of like the United States in terms of the way that the state responds to Black people and people of color organizing themselves and like living off the grid and like trying to come off of the systems and not be bound by the systems of white supremacy and capitalism that hold them down. And there's a lot of misconceptions and misinformation about what happened in the weeks leading up to that bombing, and what happened even in the narrative. Like some people don't even like call it a bombing, but it like absolutely positively was, that like an incendiary device was absolutely dropped on the home of a family. Like it was a bombing. And some people don't even repeat or like give like power to that narrative. And it's also only one of 2 times in the history of the United States, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure, that has ever happened. I think it happened once in like 1914 or something in like Kansas. But that is a movie that highlights the Move family, what they were trying to do, why they were trying to do it, the repression and the violence they were facing, both from some of their neighbors and the city, but also particularly from the police and the fire department. And it's incredibly eye-opening. And even eye-opening to see, on some level, the important work that white allies need to do, because there's a very small piece of the narrative around the handful of cops that, like, don't get me wrong, they weren't doing like great ally work, but the handful of cops that tried to step up and just be like, yo, like maybe we should treat these people like humans. There's interviews from 2 of them, I believe, who were pretty much like hazed off the force. Like they got like "End Lover" written on their lockers and shit like that, and like all this crazy stuff just for like speaking a little bit of humanity into the situation. They weren't even like, hey, don't beat these people up, but they were like, yo, y'all, maybe we can calm down a little. And they got like hazed off the force. So it's a very powerful movie and a very important movie for people to watch in terms of like what we're up against, but also like what we have come from and what like the Move family and their allies and their supports and their friends have been fighting since like not only 1985, because there's a whole bunch of other stuff that happened with the Powelton compound back in the 70s, but just in general, people getting access to that history and that narrative, I think, is probably one of the most important things I can think to speak on. So we've just decided that y'all don't know who Octavia Butler is, correct? So one of the people I would love to collaborate with in my life is Octavia Butler, because she's just amazing. So Octavia Butler, and I'm not going to even be able to do justice to her entire narrative as a human, but she is a black female sci-fi writer who focuses a lot on Afrofuturism and pushing a narrative, like critiquing hierarchy, right? Like she talks a lot about, in general in her interviews in her life, but also in her writings, this way in which like systems get set up and people with power get set up to sort of like take over weaker people, species, groups of humans. And her critique on the way that she's just, the way she writes is so beautiful and flawless and like intersectional in a way that allows you to really see where we've come from, and like gives you a little bit of fear like where we're going if we don't really break down some of this hierarchical crap in the way we live, that we allow people to have so much control over our lives. And also like being a black female writer who focuses on like uplifting the voices and the stories and the energy and like the struggles of like non-white folks and what that looks like in terms of the way one responds to domination. I have learned a lot from her in the last couple of years since I started reading her works. I'm right now reading Octavia's Brood, little plug, which is a bunch of people who have been inspired by her to write short stories and essays kind of in her energy. And she would be an amazing person to just like sit down and have a conversation with, let alone like organize or like write a story with. So she's definitely somebody I would love to collaborate with and have a lot more to learn about. And I'm like really excited to keep reading more of her works and like talking with different groups of people who also love her and respect her as a role model. And then the second person I would love to be doing more collaborative work with, but this is kind of like, he's a buddy of mine, he's a homie down in Baltimore, is Son of None. He is a Baltimore-based rapper who does a lot. His songs, his raps, his story are like stories. Like the way that he performs is not only he gives you like a whole chunk of history and like helps you learn about the ways in which, through his lens as like a black rapper in Baltimore who is like also in the struggle trying to do anti-oppression work and like, you know, black power work and black liberation work. His stories are informative, they are inspirational, they're like dope, like he's like the craziest lyricist ever. Like everyone should check out his album Art of Struggle. But I would love to do a little bit more work with him and like bridge the kind of like gap between organizing in Philly and Baltimore. That would be like a really cool thing to do. And in the last couple years, we've also talked a lot more about like the importance of self-care and the importance of mental health perspectives and trauma-informed perspectives in our communities and in our organizations, because we both feel like the hurt and like the intensity of what happens when people get burnt out and like what it means when someone needs to like step back completely from a community or from a campaign or from a work or from a group because we are not taking care of them, they are not taking care of themselves, whatever that means. So I think it would be really dope to like collab with him a little more, not only on using art and music as a way to reach people, which is like all what he's about, but also the ways in which that he uses that platform to kind of like support movements and to support the organizations that he works with in Baltimore. That would be a fabulous thing to connect a little bit more between Philly and Baltimore, because Philly and Baltimore in a lot of ways are very similar. Like they're different in a lot of ways, but they're very similar in a lot of ways, and we're so close, right? It's like 2.5 hours, not even. So yeah, Octavia Butler and Son of None. Those would be my crew to collab with in the future. Favorite musicians would have to be Diggable Planets and Sage Francis. Again, like all my other answers, because they're really great at like interweaving social justice issues into their work, and they're just really fucking talented. I'm a big like underground kind of like political consciousness hip hop head, like from up North Jersey, like rolling with crew up there from like late 90s, early 2000s. And that has been a really important part of like my inspiration and like what helps me get through really hard days is just listening to like really wise words from people who like get it and have learned how to use their knowledge through their craft, like music, like rapping, like hip hop, these things of this nature. So yeah, Sage Francis and Digable Planets, both of whom I've met, which is very exciting. And yeah, that's probably it. I think some of the values that I keep close to me in the way I live my life could be broken down to honesty, vulnerability, humility, and agitation. And what that looks like collaboratively all put together is sort of like, I know that I am a work in progress, I'm a work in process, and so is everybody else around me. So being able to have compassion and understanding that like we are always learning, we are always unlearning, we are always unpacking this crap that we were raised with is very important to me in terms of the relationships I have in my life, both professional, personal. There's a lot of blurred lines for me in between professional and personal, as you've heard. So I think like being honest with my capacities, my needs, my wants, my expectations of people, of campaigns, of groups, of the work I'm doing, being honest about that is integral for me to be able to like do what I do and do it well, and to also expect that from other people, which requires a level of like vulnerability and compassion. We need to be able to like feel comfortable with each other enough to like, you know, fuck up. And if like you fuck up, your crew who like care about you can be like, hey, so that thing you said or did or this way you're behaving is like really not cool, but it's okay, like we still love you, we just want to let you know, and like let's talk about it, right? So it's kind of like, you know, like a transformative justice frame. Like that's kind of my mission on life. And I mess up too all the time, and people gotta call me out on stuff and like call me up, and like I have really deep conversations with people who I really care about. And that is super important to my sustainability and my resiliency, is knowing that I can be flawed and vulnerable and honest with my people, and that they can do that for me because of compassion, and knowing that like our goal is to agitate this system. Our goal is to like do better, want more for ourselves, and not in that stereotypical like, you know, I gotta get more, the materialistic kind of thing, but more like wanting to be more whole, wanting to be more happy and more contented and more just like, yeah, like connected to the things and the people and the interests that you have in your life. That's kind of my mission, is to like always be striving to do more in that capacity, so that we can heal from this shit and feel better and feel more powerful. I think that balance in everything is important for all the decisions that I make in my life. And if I had to say anything to sort of wrap this all up, that would be it, is that do not let, this might sound a little cliche, but like do not let perceived barriers hold you back from things that you know you want to be doing, and that you know are important to you, and that you know give you passion and life. Like having balance in the things that you have to do for like survival, whatever that means, with like your family, with paying your bills, with this, that, and the third. Like, yes, do that, you have to do that, but also have balance in the way that you live your life to be able to do the other things that like keep you going and give you energy and give you motivation. And whether that looks like being able to like sit down and like rap and figure something out with like crew on the weekends so you can do your week better, so you can like do time management better, but balance energetically, emotionally, physically, in terms of your diet and your health and your wellness. Like having balance in life is very important to not getting burnt out, is very important to being able to realize your dreams, and like to knock down those barriers and those obstacles in a way that like maybe you couldn't if you didn't have all these little pieces of you. So yeah, being able to kind of like do it all without feeling like you're doing it all, right? So like getting a little bit of each. The way that what I've described in my life is just like the collectives work I do, the paid work I do, the family and friend work I do, that requires work. it takes work to know how to get into your groove and to know how to like keep balance, and that's a work that you're always going to be figuring out and unpacking. But my sister who's one of the most important people in my life, my sister has this rule. It's the 50% rule, and she says if there's a person or a thing that is draining you or taking more negativity of you away from you more than 50% of the time, you need to find a way to cut that out of your life, because you want more of a 60-40, 70-30 ratio. Like if there's a thing or a person in your life that is not fulfilling you in a way, that is not helping you realize your goals and your dreams and move forward, you should move them out of your life a little bit more and make them a little less prominent. Whether that's a job, whether that's a partner, whether that's a family member that you like gotta stay in contact with, but maybe you don't see them every day or even every week. Being able to find balance in your influences and balance in what you take in and what you put out is what's up. That's what it is.
We are meant to dedicate a portion of it as a final resting place of those who gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men living and dead who have struggled here have consecrated